We get sent a lot of interesting gaming devices in our mailbox, and Banggood.com reached out to us to send us something very unique that I've never really seen before. This is called the Pandora's Box 4S, and it's an arcade stick that not only works as an arcade stick that you can plug up to a computer, but it also has 815 games built into it. Let's take a look. The overall construction of this arcade stick is actually pretty solid. You got a nice metal frame and body underneath that makes it feel nice, strong, and rigid, which is very important because you've got a little handle at the front here where you can pick it up and use it as some kind of arcade suitcase, which I don't really recommend. But regardless though, you also have two really nice and strong joysticks. They sound just like they're off of a Neo Geo, which is very important. The buttons, however, are a little bit softer. They don't have the best click in the world, but they are responsive, which is important when you're looking into playing games like this. You also can replace anything on the top here pretty easily by just opening it up and unscrewing everything. But you've got something kind of neat on here which makes this board a little bit more cool. Lights. And these lights can all go rainbow colored, and I guess that's kind of neat. But when you're playing games in a dark room, well, that doesn't really work because they kind of distract you. So I usually keep it off. There's also another switch to the side that allows you to turn this into a PC arcade joystick so you can use it to play any game you want, which is a nice perk. On the back here, you have a whole bunch of different inputs like HDMI, VGA, and there's a volume button. But why is there a volume button, you might ask? That's because inside this thing, there's also a freaking speaker. I mean, I don't even know why it's back there, but it is. And if I turn it on, you'll actually be able to hear how loud it gets. It's playing the main menu music right now, which is weird. But overall, it's strange to see or hear something like that coming out of the arcade stick itself. But what makes it a little bit worse is that the arcade stick speaker is actually mounted underneath, and it shoots right down on the table you lay the arcade stick on. So even though it gets really, really loud, it kind of sounds muffled, which is unfortunate. And it also makes the entire arcade stick rumble, which might be cool for certain games. Regardless though, this entire setup is a really nice piece of hardware that I think is pretty much worth the price they're asking for. The only problem though is that this specific design that we got, which is Street Fighter V, is really heavily pixelated. No doubt in my mind they went to Google image search, found the first image, and just improperly stretched it on top of this layout here. So outside of that, everything else on here is a pretty good device. But that's not really what's important here. What's important about this joystick is basically what games are on it. Inside this pretty big arcade stick, you'll find something called Pandora's Box. Now, I know a lot of you that are watching right now probably assume that inside this is actually some kind of Raspberry Pi or something like that, but that's not actually what's in here. Instead, what you're getting is an arcade board that's made from a company out of China that is essentially kinda doing a lot of illegal stuff. The specific version of Pandora's Box that's in here is called the Pandora's Box 4S Plus. There are 815 games on here, and not one of them was officially licensed by any of the original manufacturers or developers. So while it is true you're getting a whole lot of games on here, the original developers of those games aren't seeing a penny from this thing. As you probably expect, because of all these games being bootleg software, you're gonna have a lot of problems with them running. First off, every single game you could possibly play on here is gonna have screen tearing issues. And even though on some games it's not as noticeable as others, it's always there. The second problem I ran across is that there are such a high quantity of games that I doubt anyone actually sat there and played them all. Unfortunately, they gave the system to me, so I did. And a lot of the games didn't seem to run well at all. There's frame rate issues, slowdowns, and issues with games that are so bad that they're completely unplayable. For instance, Mortal Kombat on here should be able to run fine, but it just doesn't run well at all, and I would consider this a game experience that simply doesn't work in the state that it's in. Fortunately though, because the list of games on here is so high, you're more likely going to find a game that works than doesn't, but a couple of the key titles on here that don't work really do stick out. The third issue I came across this system is that a lot of the sound effects just didn't seem to be working that well. In some instances, instances, like The Simpsons Arcade, you're missing certain notes and certain tones that just make the music not sound correct, and a lot of the other games are just missing sound effects altogether. But what's really weird is when you come across a game like Donkey Kong 3, you get the wrong music playing. And I don't mean it's playing the wrong track from one point in the game or another, I mean the music on Donkey Kong 3 on this arcade machine is actually the music from Donkey Kong Jr. for some really strange reason. And my final problem, and one that I would consider probably the worst one of them all, is that the attraction screens have been completely removed from the majority of the titles included on this system. A lot of really good classic arcade machines had these awesome animations set up at the very beginning to attract you to play them, and these attraction screens were really well done. The Simpsons had a really cool one, and so did Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but unfortunately they're completely gone when it comes to playing them on here, which I think is a huge loss. Not everything about this system is negative though, because there's actually a couple of things on here that I kind of like. Even though there's 815 games, every single game has a little tiny video to the right when you're going through the menu so you can visually gauge what the game's about. Unfortunately, not every single video actually shows you gameplay, and in some instances they only show you the title screen, but sometimes that's enough to kind of know what the game's gonna be about. Unfortunately, because there are so many games on here, it's kind of hard to find any one game that you might be looking for. There's no search option, and every single game is organized in a genre style, but they don't really tell you what the genres are, and you kind of have to guess, so it doesn't really work. And on top of that, there are also multiple versions of a lot of arcade games, some of them being hacks and some of them being modifications, and that's kind of bad as well, because if you're looking for the authentic original experience, well, you shouldn't be buying this thing anyway, but you're probably going to have a harder time trying to find the one version of Street Fighter you're looking for when there's like 15 of them. There are just so many games on this system that you're naturally gonna come across stuff you've probably never played before, and I decided to pick a handful of games that I played on this system that are at least in a playable state and probably worth checking out. The first game on here is Ninja Baseball Batman. Nope, I didn't have a stroke, this is actually what the game is called. This is a really interesting and really fun game that came out from Irem back in 1993. This arcade game features some really colorful characters, and it almost feels like a very strange anime that you've probably never seen before. But I assure you, this isn't an actual show, it's just a crazy concept for a game that works really well. The gameplay is solid, the graphics are beautiful, and the animations are done really, really well. This is a fun game to go back to and play again and again, and it's probably one of the best beat-em-ups you're probably likely to find on this system. A little while ago, I reviewed the Retrobit Generations console, and on that system, I got to play a Game Boy game called Avenging Spirit. And I didn't know this, but that was actually based off of an arcade original. And on this console here, you have access to that exact ROM. This game seems to play very well, and it's actually a really neat experience. You're a ghost that takes over other people's bodies, and you play the game that way. It's fun, it's interesting, it's different, and it's kind of unique. The next game is called Dead Connection. Now, I had never heard of this game before, but as soon as I got to the character select screen, I think I may have noticed where these characters came from. Untouchables. But anyway, the game is a really fun shoot 'em up, and you run around all over the screen just firing at all the enemies that come at you. It's a really weird kind of controlling game, but it's a really fun experience. And all the levels on here have a really good destruction quality to them that's kind of nice and highly detailed. 8-Man is a pretty decent beat 'em up with some good graphics and some fun gameplay and effects. The game itself is pretty unremarkable in the way that it's designed, but it's just a solid experience, and it's from the Neo Geo selection of games, so it's something that's probably worth playing at least once. Next up is a game called Pro Gear. Pro Gear has amazing visuals and fantastic looking animations, but it also has some really tight and fast gameplay. I've enjoyed a shoot 'em up game here and there, but this one really stands out because it feels more or less like a Metal Slug game done in the skies. I don't know why I like it so much, but something about it just really works with me. Ever since I got to play Puyo Puyo Tetris on the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4, I've been hooked on that game, but I never really played any of the previous entries of Puyo Puyo games. So when I found out that Puyo Puyo 2 was actually on here, I was pretty excited. Even though this game isn't as fast as the later versions of Puyo Puyo, I think it's still very fun to play, and you have access to both the original Puyo Puyo and this one, the sequel. But unfortunately, I think the first one has just aged significantly enough that it isn't as much fun to play as this one right here. If you know me, you probably know that one of my all-time favorite games is the NES classic Jackal from Konami. But what you might not know is that there was also an arcade version of Jackal. Now, this arcade version has far far better graphics and animations, but it also has a really long scrolling level screen that just seems to never end. It's so fun to play, and I would recommend playing it with a friend because this is probably one of the best co-op experiences you're ever going to get out of the arcades. There are plenty of other games worth trying out on this system, like Altered Beast. The arcade release has added visual depth that you don't actually see from the Sega Genesis version. But it's not alone. You've also got Pac-Man and Galaga, Bomberman Neo and Puzzle Bobble, and even Baseball Stars 1 and 2. And you can also play Super Puzzle Fighter the way it was initially meant to be played, with an arcade stick instead of a joystick. So let's wrap it up. The Pandora's box, when you look inside of it, really isn't a mystery. You've got some pretty good hardware made of a lot of nice metal components, and some pretty good plastic pieces too that feel like they're actually from an arcade setup. The stick is really good and the buttons are pretty solid. And although the buttons aren't as clicky as I'd like, the hardware itself feels really good when you use it plugged up to a PC. But that's not the question that I think is on everyone's minds right now. What you really gotta focus on is, well, inside here you got a whole bunch of games that they didn't get permission to put on. So that's a huge problem for a lot of gamers. Myself personally, that's the thing that prevents me from saying that this is something you should get, because I personally like to pay the developers of those original games money for actually having made those games and getting the rights to play them on whatever hardware we're playing. This can be an issue for a lot of gamers, and I think it's going to be one that a lot of people aren't going to be able to get across. But if you really want an arcade stick that you want to use just on your PC, this is a pretty good one to get.